Welcome to session 3 of our exploration of COVID-19 responses by American governments. In this segment, we want to take a look at COVID-19 partisanship and public opinion. In looking at this, I'd like to take a general overview of where we stand as a country in regards to partisanship outside the coronavirus, in other words, before this all happened. Then take a look at some theories by political scientists as to why we have become so partisan, and then try to apply that finally to what we see happening during the COVID-19 crisis, particularly in response to the way that the federal government has treated the COVID-19 crisis. So let's just start right from the beginning. Now, we know that we have ideological or partisan differences based on ideas, and reasonable people can disagree about solutions and not really have animosity towards each other. And that's generally the just cross discussion that we might have with friends that we disagree with. However, believing that we're right and somebody else is wrong, but the other person is good-spirited and good nature and a good person, has in fact become something that is scarce in American politics today. We have sorted ourselves out fairly well, believing that our side is right and the other side is wrong. And not only are they wrong about the ways that they want to approach policies, but they're also detrimental to the country as a whole and could be damaging our democracy. So in looking at some polling here, we've got basically a question asking both Republicans and Democrats what they think about President Trump, and then what they think about kind of the generic term for the other political party. So on the left-hand side, you see a poll of Republicans and their views on President Trump and then the Democratic Party. And they're given essentially 3 different options. One, that either President Trump or the Democrats will move the country in the right direction, they're misguided but not dangerous, or finally, the red says pose a serious threat to the country. So it's not surprising that being a Republican, most Republicans believe that President Trump is heading the country in the right direction, right? Very few people that within the Republican Party, kind of the hashtag Never Trumpers, say that he poses a serious threat to the country. Now, when faced with asking, well, what do you think about the average or typical or stereotypical Democrat, what we see is that more than 50% of Republicans say that they pose a serious threat to the country. Democrats, the other political party, poses a serious threat to the country. All right, we'll flip over to take a look at what the Democrats think about President Trump and also the Republican Party. And what we see here is that 75% of Democrats believe that President Trump poses a serious threat to the country. When asked about just the generic term about Republicans and what they mean to the country, we also see, again, about 52% of the Democratic aligned people saying that the Republican Party poses a serious threat to the country, right? This is more than just disagreeing. This is basically believing that the other side can be detrimental to the future of our country. Let's take a look at this from a different angle. Here's a question that really goes to the heart of much of what we're talking about. Oftentimes our identities is not so much with the political party that we ally with, but against the ideas of the other political party. So here's a question, why would you say that you identify as a Republican? Why would you identify as a Democrat? And what we see here is that when we're talking about the Republican parties, why do you identify as a Republican? 68% of Republicans say, I identify as a Republican because Democratic policies are bad for the country, right? That's more than actually say that they agree with Republican policies. And for the Democrats, it's not quite as broad, but 62% of Democrats say, I identify as a Democrat because Republican policies are bad for the country, right? So again, now all of a sudden we're not, again, saying I support things because I like the ideas behind that party. We're actually kind of seeing an existential threat about the other political party. The last thing I want to take a look at here is that we can't even agree on facts, right? So on the left-hand side, what you see here is that, what percent would you say, when it comes to the important issues facing the country, would you say that most Republican and Democratic voters disagree not only on plans and policies, but also on basic facts? 78% of Americans say that we disagree on basic facts behind issues. And what you see is 81% of Republicans say yes, 76% Democrats say yes as well. And the more ideological you are, so 86% of conservative Republicans say we can't agree on the facts, and 81% of liberal Democrats say we can't agree on the facts. Now that's a problem, right? On the right-hand side, you see how this kind of parses itself out in real time on a specific issue. So a majority of Americans say that higher education is going in the wrong direction. So 61% of all adults say that. Now we see, a pretty big difference here between the Republicans and the Democrats, but even a majority of Democrats say that we're headed in the wrong direction. Now, why though? All right, so maybe we agree on something for once, but why do we agree it's headed in the wrong direction? Well, the biggest reason is that tuition and costs are too high. That's the biggest reason for Democrats. The other question is, well, students are not getting the skills they need to succeed in the workplace, and all of a sudden you see kind of a pretty big distance between Democrats and Republicans on that. Too much concern about protecting students from views they might find offensive. So 75% of Republicans find that to be a problem. In other words, they really believe campuses have become too liberal, and that's the problem. Democrats don't have the problem with that. And then finally, professors are bringing their political and social views into the classroom. An overwhelming amount of Republicans essentially say, we believe that teachers are far too liberal. Democrats don't have a problem with that. So here's an issue in which we actually agree with each other, but at the end of the day, why we agree with each other is completely distorted by our views of the way higher education functions, right? So let's take a look at that in general, then just recap. One is, we believe that the other political party is an existential threat to our country. Second of all, we might identify with our political party not so much because we agree with what it actually stands for, but what it is against, which is the other party. And then finally, we can't even agree on our own set of facts. So how can we help make sense of this and move on and discuss kind of this idea of COVID-19? Well, a very good book came out a year or two ago by a political scientist named Liliana Mason called Uncivil Agreement: How Politics Became Our Identity. And she makes this argument. She says that we've generally plodded along and thought this idea of folk theory of American democracy, where we sit down, we decide we want to be a Republican or Democrat based on the issues that surround those political parties. And if those issues change, then we can switch political parties in and out. A very kind of cerebral idea behind why we might be a Republican or a Democrat. Mason comes along and she shows a lot of data from social science and various, from social psychology and a lot of other studies that shows this is just not the case. She says, as a country, we have sorted ourselves out to the point where we're on different teams. You are a Republican teammate or a Democratic teammate. And we identify ourselves so much with those teams that we see politics as a zero-sum game. And we will follow along with whatever our political party does because we believe that in order for the country to succeed, they have to succeed. Win or lose, it's a zero sum. The other side loses, I win. That's important, right? Now we're sorted on a whole bunch of different stuff. We're sorted on the basis of gender. We're sorted on the basis of race and ethnicity. We're sorted on the basis of education, and we're sorted on the basis of where we live. Whether you live in a large metropolitan area, whether you live in the suburbs, the exurbs, or whether you live in a rural area. Now, here's what she gets to the heart of. She says, the more sorted we become, the more emotionally we react to normal political events, and the more cross-cutting our identities, the more calmly we respond. But the problem is, let's just say for the Republican Party, if you happen to be a white male who attends church once or more a week and lives in a rural area, the Republican Party has come to define who you are as an individual. If, for example, you happen to be a Latina living in a big city, and you are also working in a working class job, you will end up being more likely to believe the Democratic Party is what you're in. Right? So the problem is our identity is our partisanship, and she calls that social polarization, and basically says defined by prejudice, anger, and an activism on behalf of the prejudice and anger that we have. Right? Essentially, we think that the other political party is made up of certain types of people. And those types of people are not good people, because if they were good people, they'd be in my party, right? So all of a sudden, we now view this as a zero-sum game in which my party has to win because my values are at stake as a consequence of this. And the problem is that in a democracy, that doesn't allow for cooperation and compromise, and we very much need that. And her quote is, "We hate the other party more than we love the democracy." And that social polarization obviously is not good for us. She also calls this negative partisanship. And essentially that we're really typically always wanted to have really good partisanship because that engages people in voting and getting out and talking about issues. But what we see is that the partisanship that we have right now is all about victory. Victory, not necessarily with values behind it. It is imperative, if I am a Democrat, that President Trump be defeated in November. If I am a Republican, it is imperative that if we're going to keep the country on the right track, President Trump needs to be reelected, right? So there's a very big concern about this. It clouds our judgment, how we view people, how we view issues, how we view our leaders. We take our cues from people that are partisan like us. So let's go back and see how this relates then to COVID-19. So here's a question. We'll just start out with a generic non-political question. But these are questions asked kind of, in the middle of the lockdown, stay-at-home orders, and then a couple of weeks later. Social distancing and stay-at-home orders are responsible government policies that are saving lives. And overall in the United States, 86% said yes. We had a broad consensus for a while there. However, once we get down into May, and gradually as we move on from May, all of a sudden that shrinks. And only 64% say this is a good thing. Other people are saying, hey, we got to open up the economy or we're going to be in serious trouble. Now, that's the nonpartisan view. But what we've seen over time is that really our reactions to this COVID-19 crisis have very strong partisan views, particularly when it deals with the national government. So here's the net approval of President Trump's coronavirus responses. And what we see is the top line, the red line is Republicans, who essentially a majority of Republicans believe that he's doing a good job of dealing with the coronavirus. If you are a Democrat, you are strongly opposed to the way that he's dealing with coronavirus. And in general, the American public is just below the 50% mark on how he deals with that. So all of our view of what's going on right now is shaded by our partisanship. If I'm a Republican, I'm sticking with my man. If I'm a Democrat, I believe this guy wasn't fit to be in office to begin with, and I don't believe that he's handling this crisis correctly. Republicans are also less likely to say that the outbreak has a severe health consequence to their community. And as you'll read in some of the literature associated with this session, that's partially because, at least in the early part into early June, those areas that were highest hit by COVID-19 were in large metropolitan areas, mostly on the coasts that tended to be more democratic, and what are called the flyover states or the red parts of the country didn't have quite as much. They weren't quite as hit hard by this COVID-19 crisis. So Republicans in general didn't see it as a big of a problem as Democrats did. Again, clouded by partisanship, but also partly by where we live, which is somewhat understandable. Also, when we take a look at this, Republicans are more likely than Democrats to prioritize opening up the economy as opposed to cutting down on the amount of COVID exposure that we might have. So we see, that the Republicans, about 2/3 of them say the economy is more important than the health side, whereby we see, under about 20% of Democrats believe that the economy is more important. Again, we're divided along this line. Now, just to take a quick look finally at some more deep down drilling, what we see here, if you take a look at percentage who says the US has done a good job in dealing with the coronavirus outbreak, we see that the more educated you are, the less likely you are to think that we've done a good job. And then get down to the partisanship here. See, 71% believe the U.S. has done a good job. Well, why? Because essentially the president is Republican. When you take a look at the Democrats, 73% of the Democrats have said that the U.S. hasn't done a good job. Again, because they associate Trump with failed policies, therefore Trump hasn't done a good job and the Trump administration hasn't responded well, right? And on the right side, you see a couple of polls that essentially show us that, the more conservative you are, the more liberal you are, the more likely you are essentially to believe that, the president's done a good job or not done a good job. And also international organizations working with other countries. Again, you see these big differentiations between the Republican Party most likely does not, you're not likely to be in tune with international organizations and international cooperation. Democrats are more likely to believe that's so. And we see this big kind of split, right? So as we go through here, what we see, again, our identity as Republicans or Democrats has a profound effect on the way that we view the facts of the cases coming out in COVID-19 responses by the federal government. And if we identify as a Republican, we identify with the leadership being provided by the Trump administration and believe that there's a decent job going on. If we identify as a Democrat, our tribe is not the ones in power. The other side is doing a bad job and they have to be replaced. Now, let me just end this session on a higher note. There are all kinds of studies that are done about consumer policies and partisanship. And for example, you're more likely to go to a Chick-fil-A if you are a Republican than if you're a Democrat. If you go to a Cracker Barrel, you're more likely to be a Republican. If you go to a cheesesteak factory, with Philadelphia and meet the cheesesteak factory, Cheesecake Factory, you're more likely to be a Democrat, more likely to drive a Prius, and on it goes. There are a couple of things that we agree on, and let's just close with this on a happy note. When asked whether or not they prefer beer or Coke, we're pretty much even across the board between Republicans and Democrats. When we asked what are our favorite pizza chains, again, pretty much even across that. Pepsi or Coke, no real dividing line along there. And then finally, what do we like for breakfast? Pancakes, French toast, or waffles, and pretty much the same all along partisan lines. So if it comes to those things, we're in good shape. Otherwise, we've got problems. And how we're going to resolve that in the long term remains to be seen. But the COVID crisis is nothing different than what we've seen in most other issues in American politics in recent years.